Somewhere in a quiet English country house in 1939, a small group of mathematicians, chess champions, and puzzle enthusiasts sat down to face a machine that German military commanders genuinely believed was mathematically unbreakable, a device capable of scrambling a message into one of more than 150 trillion possible combinations before it ever left a German radio operator's hands. To put that number in perspective, if every single person alive on Earth today tried a different combination every second, it would still take the entire planet population working around the clock for years just to test a meaningful fraction of the possibilities that single machine could produce with the turn of a few mechanical rotors. German high command trusted this machine so completely that they used it to coordinate U-boat wolf packs hunting Allied convoys across the Atlantic, to relay troop movements, to plan invasions, confident that no enemy on Earth could ever unscramble what it produced. They were almost right. It took the combined effort of Polish mathematicians who cracked the machine's logic years earlier, and British codebreakers who spent years refining and industrializing that breakthrough, to finally turn Germany's supposedly perfect secret weapon into an open book. And by the time they succeeded, historians estimate the war in Europe ended roughly 2 years sooner than it otherwise would have, saving, by some counts, millions of lives in the process. One machine, one mathematical secret, and a race to crack it that quietly decided the outcome of the deadliest war in human history. To understand how something as abstract as a coding machine could carry that much weight, you have to understand that the war fought over the Enigma was not really a new kind of war at all. It was the latest chapter in a contest as old as organized warfare itself. The struggle to send a message that only your own side can read, and to break the messages your enemy assumes you cannot. That contest stretches back thousands of years before anyone had ever imagined an electromechanical rotor machine, to a Spartan general trying to keep his battlefield orders secret from the very messenger carrying them. Ancient Sparta, sometime around the 5th century before the Common Era, developed one of the earliest documented military encryption tools historians have identified, a device called the skidely, a wooden rod of a specific, predetermined diameter around which a strip of leather or parchment was wound before a message was written across it lengthwise. Once unwound, the strip displayed nothing but a meaningless jumble of letters, readable again only by rewinding it around another rod of the exact same diameter, a shared physical secret between sender and receiver that meant even if an enemy intercepted the strip itself, they would see nothing but noise. A few centuries later, Julius Caesar reportedly protected his own military communications using a far simpler, but historically enormously influential method, now known as the Caesar cipher, in which each letter of a message is systematically shifted a fixed number of positions through the alphabet, a technique simple enough for a Roman courier to memorize and simple enough, unfortunately, for anyone who guessed the shift to break almost immediately. For centuries afterward, the science of secret writing remained a fairly one-sided contest, since the science of breaking those secrets, cryptanalysis, had not yet caught up. That changed dramatically in the 9th century, when the Arab scholar Al-Kindi, working in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age, wrote what is now considered the earliest surviving text describing frequency analysis, the technique of counting how often each letter appears in an encrypted message and comparing that pattern against the known frequency of letters in ordinary language. A genuinely revolutionary discovery that turned code-breaking from guesswork into a rigorous, repeatable science. Al-Kindi's breakthrough eventually forced European cryptographers, centuries later, to develop increasingly sophisticated ciphers capable of resisting frequency analysis. Most notably the Vigenère cipher, developed in 16th century France, which used a repeating keyword to shift each letter of a message by a different amount, scrambling the predictable letter patterns that had made simpler ciphers so vulnerable, earning it a reputation strong enough that it was nicknamed, for centuries, le chiffre indecipherable, the indecipherable cipher, a title that would eventually prove just as premature as the confidence German commanders would place in the Enigma machine some 3.5 centuries later. By the time the telegraph and then radio transformed how quickly military and commercial information could travel across vast distances in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the demand for genuinely secure encryption had grown into an urgent, high-stakes industry, and it was directly out of that demand that the Enigma machine itself was born, though not, surprisingly, as a weapon of war at all. A German electrical engineer named Arthur Skerbius patented his design for an electromechanical cipher machine in 1918, envisioning it primarily as a commercial product, a tool banks and businesses could purchase to protect sensitive communications and trade secrets from corporate espionage in an increasingly interconnected, telegraph-linked business world. Skerbius founded a company to manufacture and sell the machine through the early 1920s, and it was, by most accounts, a genuine commercial disappointment, too expensive and unfamiliar for most businesses to justify adopting. And Skerbius himself would die in 1929 in an entirely unrelated horse-drawn carriage accident, never living to see what his invention would eventually become in the hands of an institution he had never originally designed it for. That institution was the German military, which recognized in Skerbius's commercial failure an intelligence opportunity that few other governments had yet grasped so clearly. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the German Navy, followed by the Army and eventually the Air Force, adopted increasingly modified and strengthened versions of the Enigma machine as their standard tool for encrypting sensitive military communications, adding an external plugboard component in 1930 that dramatically multiplied the number of possible letter substitutions available, transforming what had begun as an underperforming commercial product into what German military planners genuinely, and for years correctly, believed was the most secure encryption system ever deployed at any meaningful scale. Each machine used a set of rotating mechanical rotors, an external plugboard, and a reflecting component to scramble every letter of an outgoing message according to a specific daily configuration, a setting shared only among authorized operators and changed regularly enough that even capturing a machine itself, without also knowing that day's specific settings, left an interceptor staring at what still looked like meaningless noise. By the time Adolf Hitler's regime began its rapid military expansion through the 1930s, the Enigma machine had become deeply embedded across nearly every branch of the German armed forces, carrying orders, coordinates, and strategic plans that German commanders assumed no outside power could ever meaningfully read. That assumption had already begun quietly collapsing years before the war even began, thanks to an intelligence effort most people, even today, know far less about than the more famous British code-breaking operation that followed it. Poland, sitting uneasily between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, understood earlier and more urgently than almost any other nation exactly how dangerous German military secrecy might become, and Polish military intelligence had been quietly working to break Enigma since the early 1930s, well before most of Europe had fully registered the scale of the threat gathering on its borders. A young Polish mathematician named Marian Rejewski, working alongside colleagues Jerzy Rowicki and Henryk Zygalski at Poland Cipher Bureau, achieved what French and British cryptographers, working independently around the same period, had each concluded was essentially impossible using traditional linguistic code-breaking methods alone. Rejewski approached the problem instead through pure mathematics, applying permutation group theory to reconstruct the internal wiring of the Enigma's rotors using intercepted message traffic and, crucially, intelligence material obtained through a French intelligence contact who had, through a paid German source, obtained genuine Enigma operating documents. By December 1932, Rejewski had successfully reconstructed the machine's internal logic well enough to begin reading German military communications, and over the following years, the Polish team refined their methods further, building specialized electromechanical devices they called bomba cryptologiczna, cryptologic bombs, designed to automate and dramatically speed up the search for each day's specific rotor settings. As German military encryption grew increasingly sophisticated through the late 1930s, however, adding additional rotors and expanding the plugboard's complexity, the Polish team's resources could no longer keep pace with the exploding number of possible combinations, a mathematical arms race that Poland, a comparatively small nation with limited intelligence, funding compared to the industrial powers gathering around it, simply could not sustain indefinitely on its own. With war against Germany looking increasingly inevitable, Polish intelligence made a decision that would prove genuinely pivotal to the entire war's outcome. In July 1939, just weeks before Germany's invasion of Poland, Polish cryptographers met secretly with British and French intelligence officials and handed over everything they had learned: their mathematical techniques, their reconstructed understanding of the Enigma's internal wiring, and even physical replica Enigma machines they had built themselves. A genuinely extraordinary act of foresight and cooperation that meant British codebreakers would not have to rebuild years of foundational Polish work completely from scratch once war actually began. That handoff set the stage for what would become one of the most consequential intelligence operations in modern history, centered at a quiet English country estate roughly 50 miles northwest of London called Bletchley Park. The British government code and cipher school relocated its operations there in August 1939, just days before the war officially began, and over the following months and years assembled an extraordinary, deliberately unconventional workforce: mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and crossword puzzle experts recruited specifically for their pattern recognition abilities rather than any conventional military or intelligence background. Recruitment sometimes took genuinely unusual forms, including a widely recounted episode in which British intelligence used a fiendishly difficult crossword puzzle competition, published in a national newspaper and timed under strict conditions, specifically to identify civilians with the kind of rapid, lateral pattern recognition ability code-breaking demanded, quietly approaching top performers afterward with an invitation to undertake unspecified but vital war work. At its peak, Bletchley Park employed nearly 10,000 people, the majority of them women, serving as codebreakers, translators, and operators of the specialized machinery the site depended on, a workforce whose scale and composition remained almost entirely unknown to the British public for decades after the war ended. Among the recruits was Alan Turing, a Cambridge-trained mathematician whose theoretical work on computation, developed years before the war even began, had already laid foundational groundwork for what would eventually become modern computer science, though almost nobody at the time, including Turing himself, fully grasped the scale of that future significance. Turing, working alongside fellow mathematician Gordon Welchman, took the basic concept behind the Polish bomba and dramatically expanded and industrialized it, designing an electromechanical machine the British called the bomb, a device built to mechanically test enormous numbers of possible Enigma rotor settings at a speed and scale no team of human codebreakers working by hand could ever hope to match. Breaking Enigma was never a single, clean victory, and the popular imagination often collapses years of grinding, uneven progress into a single dramatic breakthrough moment. In reality, Bletchley Park's codebreakers faced a moving target throughout nearly the entire war, as German forces periodically upgraded their machines, changed their operational procedures, and, in the case of the German Navy's version of Enigma, added an additional fourth rotor in 1942 specifically because German naval intelligence, alarmed at just how effectively Allied forces seemed to be anticipating U-boat movements, suspected, correctly, that their supposedly unbreakable code might already be compromised. That naval variant, used to coordinate the U-boat wolf packs terrorizing Allied shipping convoys across the Atlantic, proved by far the most difficult version of Enigma to crack, and for an agonizing stretch of 1942, Bletchley Park effectively lost the ability to read German naval traffic entirely, a blackout that coincided directly with a horrifying spike in Allied merchant ship losses in the Atlantic, a devastating, concrete illustration of exactly how much genuine strategic weight these code-breaking efforts actually carried in the real world, measured not in abstract mathematics, but in the lives of merchant sailors crossing an ocean that had, for a period, become lethally unpredictable again. Bletchley Park's eventual success against this hardened naval cipher depended not just on mathematics, but on a series of daring, high-risk physical intelligence operations, missions the codebreakers themselves referred to as pinches, deliberate efforts to physically capture Enigma machines, codebooks, and settings documents directly from German vessels, sometimes in operations of extraordinary danger. Carried out by sailors who had no idea their raid was part of a secret code-breaking effort at all, only that recovering specific documents and equipment from a sinking or captured vessel had been designated an urgent priority. In May 1941, British naval forces captured the German submarine U-110 before its crew could fully destroy their sensitive materials, recovering an intact naval Enigma machine along with crucial codebooks. And similar captures from German weather ships and other vessels throughout the war provided the kind of foundational material that let Bletchley Park's mathematicians and engineers refine their methods and eventually claw back the ability to read even the most heavily fortified German naval traffic. The intelligence produced from this entire effort, given the classified codename Ultra, became so operationally valuable that British and eventually American commanders had to make agonizing decisions throughout the war about when and how they could actually act on what Ultra revealed without giving away to German intelligence that their supposedly unbreakable code had, in fact, been broken, a secrecy so total and so carefully maintained that entire Allied military operations were sometimes deliberately shaped or even occasionally sacrificed specifically to protect the fact that Enigma had fallen. The scale of Ultra's actual impact on the war's outcome is genuinely difficult to overstate, and historians who have studied the intelligence archives extensively, including the official historian of British wartime intelligence, Harry Hinsley, have estimated that Ultra intelligence, drawn overwhelmingly from broken Enigma traffic, shortened the war in Europe by a period commonly cited as roughly 2 years, sparing the world an additional 2 years of the devastating bloodshed the conflict was already inflicting on a staggering global scale. Convoy routes across the Atlantic were redirected around U-boat concentrations that Allied commanders knew about specifically because they were reading German naval communications describing exactly where those U-boats had been ordered to patrol. Rommel's supply and troop movements across North Africa were tracked and anticipated with a precision that repeatedly caught German commanders off guard. Even the planning and eventual success of the D-Day invasion in June 1944 benefited enormously from Ultra intelligence confirming, in the crucial days beforehand, that German high command had genuinely been deceived by Allied efforts to convince them the invasion would land elsewhere. And yet, for decades after the war ended, almost none of this reached public knowledge at all. The British government maintained total secrecy around Bletchley Park's achievements well into the 1970s, and the thousands of men and women who had worked there, having signed binding secrecy agreements under the Official Secrets Act, returned to entirely ordinary post-war civilian lives without ever being able to tell family members, friends, or even spouses what they had actually spent the war doing. Many former Bletchley Park staff carried this secret quietly for the rest of their working lives, taking ordinary post-war jobs as teachers, clerks, or homemakers, occasionally enduring family members' quiet disappointment or confusion at how little they seemed to have contributed to a war effort in which they had, in reality, played some of the single most consequential roles of the entire conflict, receiving none of the public recognition their wartime work had genuinely earned until many of them had already died without ever hearing a word of public thanks. Alan Turing himself, whose contributions to breaking Enigma were foundational to the entire operation's success, never lived to see even a fraction of that eventual recognition. In 1952, Turing was prosecuted under British law for homosexual acts, then still criminalized, and rather than face imprisonment, accepted a court-mandated regimen of hormonal treatment intended, according to the medical thinking of the era, to suppress what the law of the time treated as criminal behavior. Turing died in 1954, in circumstances an inquest ruled a suicide, just 2 years after a legal and medical persecution that treated one of the most important contributors to the Allied victory as a criminal rather than a hero, a genuinely devastating final chapter to a life that had, less than a decade earlier, helped determine the outcome of the deadliest war humanity has ever fought. Turing's work, however, did not disappear alongside the secrecy that surrounded it, and its influence reached far beyond the specific machines and methods used to break Enigma itself. The theoretical framework Turing had developed even before the war, describing an abstract machine capable of performing any computation that could be precisely defined by a set of rules, would go on to become one of the foundational concepts underlying modern computer science entirely, and the practical, engineering-driven code-breaking work carried out at Bletchley Park, including the later development of an early electronic computer called Colossus, built specifically to help break a separate, an even more complex German cipher system used for high-level strategic communications, represented some of the very first working steps toward the general-purpose electronic computers that would reshape the entire world in the decades that followed. It would take until 2009 for the British government to issue a formal public apology for Turing's wartime-era persecution, and until 2013 for Queen Elizabeth II to grant him a formal royal pardon. Gestures that, while genuinely meaningful, arrived roughly 60 years too late to matter to the man they were meant to honor, though today his name lives on prominently in the Turing Award, widely considered computer science's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, awarded annually to researchers whose work has most deeply shaped the field Turing himself helped originate. The broader legacy of the entire Enigma story reaches directly into daily life in ways almost nobody pauses to consider while living inside it. Every time a modern smartphone encrypts a text message before sending it, every time an online banking application scrambles financial data before transmitting it across the internet, every time a simple padlock icon appears in a web browser confirming that a connection is secure, that entire infrastructure of modern digital privacy and cybersecurity descends directly, conceptually and historically, from exactly the same underlying mathematical battlefield fought out at Bletchley Park and in the Polish Cipher Bureau decades earlier. The same fundamental contest between those trying to scramble information beyond an outsider's reach and those trying to unscramble it anyway. Modern encryption is vastly more mathematically sophisticated than anything Arthur Skerbius could have imagined when he patented his commercial cipher machine in 1918, but the essential logic driving it, and the high-stakes urgency behind why governments, corporations, and ordinary individuals alike continue investing enormous resources into staying one step ahead in that same ancient contest, traces a direct, unbroken line back through Turing's bomb, Rajewski's mathematical breakthrough, Al-Kindi's frequency analysis in 9th century Baghdad, and further back still, to a Spartan general winding a leather strip around a wooden rod, trying to keep a single battlefield message safe from the very messenger tasked with carrying it, a contest that has never once actually ended, only changed its tools. That is the shift worth carrying with you long after the story ends. A war that most people remember through tanks, bombers, and beach landings was also, quietly and almost invisibly, a war fought inside the abstract space of mathematics and logic, decided as much by mathematicians hunched over rotor wirings in a converted English mansion as by soldiers on any physical battlefield, and the outcome of that hidden mathematical war shaped, and arguably shortened, everything that followed it. Every secure message sent today rides on the same intellectual foundation those codebreakers built under conditions of total secrecy, receiving none of the recognition their work deserved until decades after it had already changed the course of history. A reminder that some of the most consequential battles ever fought leave no visible scars on any landscape at all, only a silence that, once you finally understand what it was protecting, becomes impossible to ever look at the same way again.